Hello there, and welcome to Nick's Documentaries, where the darkness is not something to fear, but a space where ancient mysteries can finally breathe. Tonight, we're not staying in the present, nor are we venturing into the distant geological past. Instead, we're stepping into a world that feels both impossibly distant and strangely close. A world of sand and stone, of gods and kings, of monuments so vast they seem to mock the passage of time itself. This is the story of ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of textbooks with their neat timelines and certain answers, but the Egypt that still whispers from beneath the sand. The Egypt of unanswered questions, of tombs that guard their secrets, and of a civilization so advanced, so mysterious, that even after centuries of study, we find ourselves standing at its edge, looking inward, wondering how much we've truly understood. Before we begin this journey into the deep shadows of the Nile Valley, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something profound about the fact that you and I, separated by distance and perhaps by daylight and darkness, can share this same quiet moment, contemplating a civilization that ended thousands of years ago, yet somehow still speaks. If this kind of deep exploration into the unknown is what draws you here, I'd be grateful if you tapped like or subscribed. It helps this quiet signal reach other minds that wander in the dark, searching for something beyond the surface. No pressure, of course, just an invitation, like a torch held at the entrance of a tomb, suggesting there might be something worth seeing inside. So settle in, let the world around you fade, and prepare to step backward, not just through years or centuries, but through millennia, into a land where the living built for the dead, where the desert met the river, and where humanity first began to ask the questions that still haunt us. What happens when we die? How do we transcend time? And what will remain of us when everything else has turned to dust? The first thing you need to understand about ancient Egypt is that it wasn't ancient to itself. For 3,000 years, this civilization rose each morning along the banks of the Nile, built its cities, buried its dead, and watched the sun arc across a sky that seemed to promise eternity. 3,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. When Cleopatra walked the halls of Alexandria, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already older to her than she is to us. The depth of Egypt's history is so profound that the Egyptians themselves looked back at their own monuments with a kind of wonder, studying ruins that had already stood for millennia. This was not a civilization that burst into existence fully formed. It was born slowly, emerging from the prehistoric settlements that clustered along the Nile's fertile banks. Before there were pharaohs, before there were pyramids, there were simple farming communities learning to read the river's rhythms, to plant when the flood waters receded, to store grain against the lean seasons. These early people watched the sun rise and set, watched the stars wheel overhead, and began to see patterns. Meaning, the first threads of what would become one of history's most complex religious and philosophical systems. Around 1000 BCE, something changed. The scattered kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt unified under a single ruler, a king who would come to be known as Narmer or Menes, depending on which tradition you follow. This unification marked the beginning of what we call the early dynastic period, but more importantly, it marked the birth of an idea that a single divine ruler could embody the order of the cosmos itself, holding back chaos, maintaining ma'at, the balance that kept the world from sliding into disorder. From that moment forward, Egypt became something more than a collection of villages. It became a nation with a purpose, a civilization with a mission that transcended mere survival. The Egyptians believed they were living at the center of creation, in a land blessed by the gods, and that their role was to maintain the cosmic order through ritual, through construction, through the elaborate preparation of the dead for their journey into the afterlife. And they built, oh, how they built! The monuments they left behind, the pyramids, the temples, the tombs carved deep into living rock, these were not just displays of wealth or power. They were statements of belief, arguments made in stone against the inevitability of death and forgetting. Each pyramid was a machine for resurrection, each temple a place where the boundary between the human and divine grew thin, each tomb a vessel carrying the deceased into eternity. But here's what makes ancient Egypt so endlessly fascinating, so endlessly mysterious. Despite all that they left behind, despite the thousands of inscriptions, the painted walls, the carefully preserved bodies, there is still so much we don't understand. The Egyptians were masters of symbolism, of layered meaning, and they wrote for an audience that shared their cultural context, their myths, their unspoken assumptions. When we read their texts today, we're reading through a veil, seeing shadows of meanings we can only partially grasp. How did they build the pyramids? We have theories, of course, ramps and levers and an endless supply of labor. But the precision, the astronomical alignments, the sheer audacity of the engineering, these still spark debate. Why did they mummify their dead with such elaborate care? We know they believed in an afterlife, but the specifics of their beliefs, the journey through the underworld, the weighing of the heart, these concepts are so foreign to our modern minds that we struggle to truly comprehend what they meant to the people who lived them. And then there are the mysteries that go deeper still. The curses whispered about in tombs, the advanced knowledge of mathematics and astronomy that seems at times almost impossible for a Bronze Age civilization, the sudden shifts in artistic style and religious focus that suggest revolutions we can only glimpse through fragments. The question of how much knowledge was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned, when the last priests of the old religion died without passing on their secrets, when the desert sands covered temples and cities that we've only recently begun to uncover. Right? To study ancient Egypt is to stand at the edge of a vast darkness, holding a small lamp, seeing just enough to know how much remains unseen. Every tomb opened reveals new questions. Every translation of an ancient text offers new puzzles. The more we learn, the more we realize how much has been lost, how much we may never know. And yet there's something profoundly moving about this pursuit. The Egyptians built for eternity, and in a way, they succeeded. We speak their names. We study their lives. We stand in the shadows of their monuments and feel something, a connection across the millennia, a recognition that they too wondered about death, about meaning, about what remains when everything else is gone. As we move deeper into this exploration, we'll walk through the ages of Egypt, from its pre-dynastic origins to its final days under foreign rule. We'll examine the pyramids and what they might truly represent. We'll descend into tombs and try to understand the elaborate rituals of death and rebirth. We'll meet the gods, strange and powerful beings that embodied natural forces and human hopes. We'll look at the art, the hieroglyphs, the daily life of people who lived in the shadow of eternity. But most importantly, we'll sit with the mysteries, the unanswered questions, the gaps in our knowledge, because sometimes the unknown is not a problem to be solved, but a space to be inhabited, a reminder that for all our technology and all our science, there are still things that slip through our fingers like sand, things that refuse to be fully known, things that whisper from the darkness and invite us to lean closer, to listen harder, to wonder. The night is long and Egypt's secrets are deep. Let's begin. Long before the first pyramid rose from the desert sands, before the first pharaoh wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, there was the river, the Nile, It is impossible to understand ancient Egypt without understanding the river that gave it life, that shaped every aspect of its culture, its religion, its very survival. Kenk, the Nile is not like other rivers. It flows northward, counter to expectation, cutting through one of the harshest deserts on earth, bringing life to a narrow ribbon of land that would otherwise be as barren as the wastes that flank it on either side. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. The desert would extend unbroken from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, and human civilization in this region would have been impossible. But the Nile was more than just a source of water. It was a clock, a calendar, a god. Each year, with remarkable reliability, the river would swell, fed by distant rains in the highlands of Ethiopia, rains the Egyptians themselves never saw, but whose effects they depended upon absolutely. A flood would come, rising slowly, spilling over the riverbanks, covering the fields with a layer of rich, dark silt carried from deep in Africa. Then, after weeks, the waters would recede, leaving behind soil so fertile that crops would spring from it with minimal effort. This annual cycle became the foundation of Egyptian life. They divided their year into 3 seasons based on the river's behavior: Aket, the inundation, when the fields flooded; Pered, the growing season, when crops were planted and tended; Shemu, the harvest, when the fields yielded their bounty and the river ran low. Everything, from agriculture to religious festivals to the scheduling of construction projects, was tied to this rhythm. The Egyptians saw the Nile's flood as nothing short of miraculous, a divine gift. They personified the inundation as the god Hapi, depicted as a pot-bellied figure bringing abundance, his body the color of the life-giving water and fertile mud. Temples were built in his honor. Hymns were sung praising the flood. The pharaoh himself was understood to have a role in ensuring the flood's return, his divine power maintaining the cosmic order that kept the waters flowing and the land fertile. And this fertility created something rare in the ancient world: surplus. While other Bronze Age civilizations struggled with unpredictable harvests and frequent famines, Egypt's agricultural abundance allowed for specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could become craftsmen, priests, scribes, soldiers, administrators. This surplus was the foundation upon which the pyramids were built, not through slave labor as popular imagination often suggests, but through a system of organized labor supported by the wealth the Nile provided. The river was also Egypt's highway. With prevailing winds blowing south and the current flowing north, boats could travel easily in both directions. This made Egypt remarkably unified for an ancient civilization, allowing for the movement of goods, people, and ideas along its entire length. Stone quarried in the south could be floated north to construction sites. Grain from the delta could feed workers in Thebes. Administrative decrees from the pharaoh's court could reach the furthest provinces. But the Nile also defined Egypt's boundaries and shaped its worldview. To the east and west lay deserts, Deshret, the Red Land, domains of chaos and death where the sun god struggled each night against the serpent of darkness. But the narrow strip of fertility along the river, Kemet, the Black Land, was the realm of order, of life, of civilization. Beyond Egypt's borders, the world grew less certain, less orderly, less real. This geography gave the Egyptians a profound sense of security and isolation. Unlike Mesopotamia, which was constantly invaded by neighboring peoples, Egypt was protected by deserts to the east and west, by cataracts and rapids to the south, by the Mediterranean to the north. For much of its early history, Egypt developed in relative isolation, building a culture that was distinctly its own, untroubled by the need to constantly defend against or assimilate foreign influences. the river also shaped Egyptian religion in fundamental ways. The daily journey of the sun across the sky was mirrored in the flow of the river through the land. Life, death, and rebirth, the central themes of Egyptian belief, were enacted each year in the flood cycle. The gods themselves were often associated with aspects of the Nile: Osiris with the fertile silt, Sobek the crocodile god with the river's dangers, Khnum the creator god, who fashioned humans on his potter's wheel from Nile mud. Dust. To stand on the banks of the Nile in ancient times would have been to see the entire world in microcosm. The desert cliffs in the distance, glowing red in the setting sun, marking the boundary between order and chaos. The green fields stretching toward those cliffs, impossibly lush, crowded with date palms and grain. The river itself, brown with silt or clear and blue depending on the season, dotted with boats, their white sails catching the wind. And perhaps, if you looked carefully, you might see the distant shape of a pyramid on the western horizon, placed there deliberately in the realm of the setting sun, the land of the dead. The earliest Egyptians, those who lived before the dynasties began, were already deeply attuned to the Nile's rhythms. Archaeological evidence shows settled agricultural communities going back to Lok-10 BCE or earlier, clustered along the river's banks. These early people learned which plants grew well in the post-flood soil, how to store grain in sealed pits to protect it from moisture and pests, how to divert water into irrigation channels to extend the growing season. But they also began the process of making meaning from their environment. They buried their dead in the desert sands, where the dry heat naturally mummified the bodies, preserving them in ways that must have seemed miraculous. Did this accidental preservation plant the first seeds of the elaborate mummification practices that would later define Egyptian culture? Did the sight of preserved ancestors, their features still recognizable after death, suggest to these early people that death might not be an absolute end? They also began to create art, simple pottery at first, decorated with images of boats and animals and human figures, then more sophisticated works, carved ivory, shaped flint, small sculptures. In these early, we can see the beginning of the symbolic language that would later flower into hieroglyphic writing, into the complex iconography of Egyptian religion. By the time the Nile Valley began to unify politically, around Sanchenibite BCE, the foundations of Egyptian civilization were already in place. The agricultural system that would support monumental construction, the religious ideas that would justify divine kingship, the artistic traditions that would become immediately recognizable as distinctly Egyptian. All of it growing from the dark soil the river laid down each year, nourished by the same waters that had flowed since long before humans walked these banks. And the river continued, impassive and eternal, as empires rose and fell along its course. When the pyramids were built, the Nile flooded. When they fell into ruin, it flooded still. When the last native pharaohs were conquered by Alexander, when Cleopatra died and Egypt became a province of Rome, when the temples were abandoned and the hieroglyphs forgotten, the river kept flowing, kept flooding, kept depositing its silt, indifferent to human drama, eternal in a way that even the pyramids, built to last forever, could never quite achieve. To understand Egypt, you must begin with the river. Everything else flows from it. The unification of Egypt was not a single moment, though later tradition would remember it that way. It was a process, a gradual consolidation of power that transformed the Nile Valley from a patchwork of competing chiefdoms into a unified state under a single ruler. But the mythology that grew around this event tells us something important about how the Egyptians understood their own origins, so their own purpose. According to tradition, a king named Narmer, sometimes identified with the legendary Menes, united Upper Egypt the southern Nile Valley, with Lower Egypt, the Delta region in the north. This unification is depicted on one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Egypt, the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone carved with images of the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, symbolically enacting the joining of the two lands. The imagery on the palette is striking and brutal. Narmer is shown as a giant compared to his enemies, grasping a captive by the hair, his arm raised to strike. Elsewhere, decapitated enemies lie in rows, their heads placed between their legs. This is not merely symbolic, it's a declaration. The unification was achieved through conquest, through the forceful subjugation of one region by another, and the art doesn't shy away from this violence. Instead, it elevates it to cosmic significance. The king is not merely a warlord, he is the embodiment of order itself, crushing chaos, bringing the world into proper alignment. This act of unification, whether it happened exactly as tradition describes or not, marks the beginning of dynastic Egypt, the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids that would endure for 3 millennia. And with it came a radical new concept of kingship, one that would define Egyptian culture for its entire history. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was divine. The Egyptian concept of divine kingship was complex and multi-layered. The pharaoh was understood to be the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god, son of Osiris and Isis, the rightful ruler of the earth. At the same time, he was the son of Ra, the sun god, inheriting divine authority directly from the creator of the universe. When he died, he would become Osiris himself, joining the gods in the afterlife, while his successor took on the mantle of Horus. This cycle of death and renewal, of father becoming ancestor god and son becoming living god, was central to Egyptian role. But divine kingship wasn't just about religion. It was a political necessity, a way of legitimizing the extraordinary power concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The pharaoh owned Egypt, all of it. Theoretically, every piece of land, every cow, every grain of wheat belonged to him. Of course, in practice, this absolute ownership was mediated through temples, nobles, and administrators. But the principle remained: Egypt was the pharaoh's estate, and its people were his to command. Again, this divine authority allowed pharaohs to mobilize labor on an unprecedented scale. When a pyramid needed to be built, tens of thousands of workers could be called up, fed from the royal granaries, organized into crews and shifts, directed by royal architects and administrators. This wasn't slavery in the way we often imagine it. Workers were paid, housed, fed, even given medical care. But it was compulsory, a form of taxation in labor rather than goods, and it was only possible because the pharaoh's divine status made obedience a religious obligation as much as a civic one. The symbols of this divine power were carefully cultivated. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, represented the unification of the two lands under a single ruler. The crook and flail, shepherd's tools, suggested the pharaoh's role as protector and provider for his people, guiding them as a shepherd guides his flock. The false beard, a ceremonial accessory worn by pharaohs in formal contexts, linked them to the gods, particularly to Osiris, who was depicted wearing such a beard. The pharaoh's names were themselves powerful magic. Each ruler had 5 names, acquired at different points in their reign, each encoding different aspects of their divine mission. The throne name and birth name were written inside cartouches, oval frames that represented eternity, symbolically protecting the names forever. To speak the pharaoh's name was to invoke their power, to acknowledge their authority, to participate in the cosmic order they embodied, With this elevated status, however, came heavy obligations. The pharaoh could not govern on a whim. He was entrusted with protecting Ma'at, the universal principle of truth, fairness, and harmony that sustained existence itself. His task was to preserve balance, to keep the Nile cycles regular, the sun's daily journey uninterrupted, and the stars moving in their appointed paths. Neglecting this responsibility was believed to have far-reaching effects. An ineffective or irreverent ruler could invite famine, foreign threats, or widespread instability. Favor from higher powers might fade, and the land could descend into disorder. Plan this idea of Ma'at-shaped Egyptian life at every level. It was more than a tool of governance. If a framework, living in harmony with Ma'at meant speaking honestly, acting with generosity, honoring established roles, observing proper rites, and sustaining order in daily life. To reject it through deceit, theft, or disrespect towards sacred traditions or royal authority was seen as siding with chaos, the ever-present force believed to undermine creation. During the earliest ruling periods, known as the Early Dynastic Era and the Old Kingdom, this system became firmly established. Complex administrations emerged, scribes recorded transactions, officials managed regions, and taxes were collected to support the state. Writing, which had appeared shortly before political unification, was refined into a standardized system, allowing authority to be organized, communicated, and reinforced. Royal building projects also took shape early on. Long before the famous pyramids, rulers of the first two dynasties constructed elaborate burial complexes at Abydos and Saqqara. These featured underground chambers, surrounding graves, and carefully prepared goods meant for the next existence. Though modest compared to later monuments, they set a clear precedent. The ruler, in death as in life, occupied a distinct and elevated position, marked by symbols of sacred authority. This vision reached its peak during the Old Kingdom, beginning around Arsene-Lupide Bachelot BCE, with the Third Dynasty. Era of monumental, when rulers commanded immense resources to create structures so vast, they still dominate the landscape today. These pyramids were not merely burial places. They were powerful symbols, stone declarations that the ruler possessed an exceptional, almost otherworldly authority, capable of reshaping the natural world. Planned political unification thus produced more than a single state. It created a complete way of understanding reality. Order was believed to depend on a central ruler who stood between humanity and the unseen forces governing the universe, holding chaos at a distance simply by fulfilling his role. This outlook, adapted over time, endured for nearly 3 millennia, surviving invasions, internal conflicts, shifting dynasties, and even profound changes in language and culture. Its origins lay in that first moment of unity, when Upper and Lower Egypt became one, when a ruler adopted the symbols of both regions and claimed not only supreme authority, but a uniquely sacred role. The Egyptians embraced this model as their solution to an unpredictable world: how to secure the Nile's floods, restrain the desert, and keep uncertainty at bay. For a while, it seemed successful. Monuments were raised, crops flourished, the sun followed its daily path, and at the center of it all sat the ruler, crowned with the symbols of unity, holding the emblems of authority, charged with preserving balance and stability. That was the vision, at least. As history would reveal, reality proved far more complex. When you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza and look up, your mind struggles to process what you're seeing. The scale is wrong. No ancient people should have been able to build this. And yet there it stands, 2.5 million blocks of limestone and granite, some weighing as much as 80 tons, fitted together with such precision that in places you can't slide a knife blade between them. For more than 3,800 years, it was the tallest human-made structure on Earth. Even now, weathered and stripped of its smooth limestone casing, it rises nearly 8 meters into the Egyptian sky, a monument that seems to mock our assumptions about what Bronze Age technology could achieve. The pyramids of Giza, the three great structures built by the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, along with their smaller companion pyramids, temples, and the enigmatic Sphinx, are the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. They've been stared at, measured, theorized about, and mystified over for millennia. Ancient Greek tourists came to see them, already ancient, already mysterious. Arab scholars studied them. Napoleon's soldiers marveled at them. Modern archaeologists have excavated around them, beneath them, inside them, and still, they hold secrets. The first question everyone asks is, how? How did the Egyptians, working with copper tools, wooden sledges, and rope, move and place millions of tons of stone with such precision? We have theories, of course. Ramps are the most commonly proposed solution. Long earthen ramps that would have grown as the pyramid grew, allowing workers to drag stones up to ever higher levels. But the logistics are staggering. The volume of material in such a ramp, if it were to reach the top of the Great Pyramid, would rival the volume of the pyramid itself. And then there's the question of the internal chambers, the passages and galleries that rise through the heart of the structure. How were those constructed and aligned while the pyramid was being built around them? Some researchers have proposed internal ramps spiraling up through the pyramid's core, but this theory has its own problems. Others suggest that the stones were hauled up the faces of the pyramid itself, or that counterweights were used, or that the blocks were cast in place from a kind of early concrete, though this last idea has been largely dismissed by the archaeological community. The truth is, we don't know for certain. We have evidence of how Egyptians moved and lifted stone. We have their tools, their sledges, their remains of ramps at other sites, but the exact method used at Giza remains a matter of educated guesswork. Then there's the precision. The Great Pyramid's base is leveled to within a few centimeters across a span of cubic centimeters. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy, less than 1/10 of a degree off true north. The internal passages are built on precise angles, and the so-called King's Chamber is constructed with granite blocks fitted so exactly that the entire room, despite bearing thousands of tons of stone above it, has maintained its shape for 45 centuries. And this precision has led to all manner of speculation. Were the Egyptians encoding advanced mathematical knowledge into the pyramid's dimensions? The ratio of the pyramid's height to the perimeter of its base approximates r pi, the same ratio as the radius of a circle to its circumference. Coincidence or deliberate? The pyramid's orientation seems to align with certain stars as they would have appeared in Arsène Wubak BCE. Coincidence or astronomical observatory? Some have proposed that the three pyramids of Giza are positioned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, though others dispute this. Most mainstream view among Egyptologists is that the pyramids are exactly what they appear to be. Tombs. Elaborate, expensive, enormous tombs built to house the bodies of dead pharaohs and facilitate their journey into the afterlife. The pyramid shape itself may have had symbolic significance, perhaps representing the rays of the sun, down which the pharaoh's soul would descend from heaven, or perhaps echoing the shape of the Benben, the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite being identified as the tomb of Khufu, the Great Pyramid contained no body when it was first opened in the 12th century CE. The granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber was found empty, its lid missing. No inscriptions identify the pyramid as Khufu's, except for some quarry marks deep inside the structure, hidden from view, marks that some have questioned as later additions, though most Egyptologists accept them as genuine. Now, other pyramids contain texts, elaborate inscriptions known as the pyramid texts, spells and incantations designed to help the deceased pharaoh navigate the afterlife. But the Great Pyramid, the most elaborate pyramid ever built, contains none. Its chambers are bare stone, silent and enigmatic. Why this absence of decoration? Was the pyramid robbed so thoroughly in antiquity that even the inscriptions were removed? Or were there never any inscriptions to begin with? The construction of the pyramids also raises questions about Egyptian society. How was labor organized? Earlier theories proposed massive slave labor, popularized by Hollywood and biblical traditions, but archaeological evidence from workers' villages near the pyramids tells a different story. These workers were paid, fed on a diet rich in meat, given medical care when injured, and buried near the monuments they helped construct, an honor that would not have been afforded to slaves, likely farmers, conscripted during the inundation season when their fields were flooded and they couldn't work them anyway, fulfilling a labor obligation to the state. Can graffiti left by work gangs, inscriptions like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkore, suggest a sense of pride, even camaraderie, among the workers? Building the pyramid was seen as an honor, a chance to participate in the pharaoh's eternal life, to help the god-king achieve immortality. This wasn't slavery, it was devotion, mixed perhaps with more practical motivations like food security and the opportunity to be part of something monumental. The sheer organization required a staggering. Feeding tens of thousands of workers daily required a supply chain that stretched up and down the Nile. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and placed, all coordinated to an overall architectural plan that existed only in the minds of the architects and the marks they made on papyrus or limestone flakes. The fact that this worked, that the pyramids were completed, is perhaps as impressive as the structures themselves. But pyramids weren't unique to Giza or even to the Old Kingdom. The first true pyramid, the Red Pyramid at Dashur, was built by Khufu's father Sneferu, who apparently learned through trial and error, first building the bent pyramid, whose angle had to be changed mid-construction to prevent collapse. Before Sneferu, there was the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the first large-scale stone structure in Egypt, a series of mastabas stacked one atop another, reaching toward the sky, and after the giants of Giza came smaller pyramids, lesser monuments built by weaker dynasties, some so poorly constructed they've collapsed into rubble. The pyramid building tradition continued into the Middle Kingdom, then revived briefly in the New Kingdom, and even the Nubian kings of the 25th dynasty built steep-sided pyramids in Sudan, long after the tradition had died out in Egypt proper. What all these pyramids represent is an obsession, a civilization-wide commitment to monumentalizing death, to building structures that would outlast everything, that would stand as long as the sun rose and the Nile flooded, structures through which the divine kings could ascend to the stars and live forever among the gods. And in a way it worked. We speak the names of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkore. We stand in the shadows of their monuments. Their bodies may be lost, their treasures scattered, their very faces unknown, but they achieved a kind of immortality nonetheless. Remember, their works endure, and we 4,500 years later still look at what they built and ask, how? Why? What did it mean? The pyramids don't answer. They never have. They stand silent in the desert, holding their secrets, inviting us to wonder, and refusing, always refusing, to fully explain themselves. If the pyramids represented Egypt's attempt to conquer death, through monumental architecture, then mummification was its attempt to conquer death through preservation of the body itself. The Egyptians believed that a person consisted of multiple parts, not just a body and soul in the way we might understand it, but a complex assembly of elements, each with its own name and nature. The Ka, a kind of life force or double, the Ba, often translated as soul, depicted as a bird with a human head, the Ib, the heart, seat of emotion and intelligence, the Ren, the name which had its own power and could outlive the body, and the the transfigured spirit that would live in the afterlife if all went well. For these various aspects of a person to survive death and function in the afterlife, the body had to remain intact. If the flesh decayed, if the body was lost, then the Ka would have nowhere to return, the Ba would have no home, and the person would face a second, final death from which there was no return. This terror of obliteration drove the Egyptians to develop the most sophisticated preservation techniques the ancient world ever produced. Mummification as a deliberate practice developed gradually. As mentioned earlier, the earliest Egyptians noticed that bodies buried in the dry desert sand were naturally preserved, desiccated by the heat and dryness before decay could set in. But as burial practices, as the wealthy began to be buried in coffins and tombs rather than simple sand graves, these began to decay. The very attempts to honor the dead with elaborate burials were destroying them. So the Egyptians learned to artificially replicate what the desert had done naturally. By the time of the New Kingdom, around Echenwubite Wushers BCE, the process had been refined to an art form. Here's how it worked, and be warned, this is not a gentle procedure. When someone died, their body was taken to the Per-Nefer, the house of beautification, where the embalmers worked. These were specialists, priests of a sort, performing a sacred duty under the patronage of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification. The body was first washed, cleaned, and laid out on a slanted table that allowed fluids to drain away. Then came the most delicate and disturbing part, removal of the internal organs. The brain was extracted first, using a long bronze hook inserted through the nostril, breaking through the ethmoid bone into the cranial cavity. The brain was whisked into a semi-liquid state and drained out. The Egyptians had no particular reverence for the brain. They didn't understand its function, and so it was simply discarded. Next, an incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, and the internal organs were carefully removed. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Each was separately preserved and placed in its own container, a canopic jar, each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was left in place. The heart was crucial. It would be needed in the afterlife, weighed against the feather of Ma'at to determine the deceased's worthiness. Without the heart, there could be no judgment, no afterlife. With the organs removed, the body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and salt found in dry lake beds. The natron desiccated the body, drawing out all moisture, preventing bacterial growth. The body was left in natron for 40 days, turning gradually from soft flesh to something more like leather, preserved unchanging. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was washed again. The empty abdominal cavity was packed with linen, sawdust, or sometimes aromatic resins to restore the body's shape. The skin was rubbed with oils and unguents to make it supple again. Sometimes, in the case of important individuals, the face was packed with linen beneath the skin to restore a lifelike appearance. False eyes might be added, the body painted to restore color to the desiccated skin. Then came the wrapping, hundreds of yards of linen strips, each carefully wound around the body in a specific pattern. with amulets placed between the layers, scarabs, jed pillars representing Osiris's spine, the Eye of Horus for protection and wholeness. The wrapping was itself a ritual, accompanied by prayers and incantations. When finished, the mummy looked like a human figure wrapped in white linen, its features obscured, its form preserved for eternity. But the physical process was only part of mummification. The true purpose was magical, spiritual. The wrapping of the body recreated the mythological wrapping of Osiris, the first being to be mummified according to Egyptian myth. By replicating this sacred act, the deceased became like Osiris, transformed, ready to be resurrected in the afterlife, just as Osiris had been resurrected. This is where things get even more mysterious. The spells and incantations performed during mummification were designed to reanimate the body, not physically, but in the spiritual realm. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on the mummy before burial, used special instruments to symbolically restore the deceased's ability to breathe, eat, see, hear, speak. The mummy wasn't meant to be inert, preserved meat. It was meant to be alive in some sense, functioning in the land of the dead. We found thousands of mummies, from pharaohs to commoners, from sacred animals to pets. Some are exquisitely preserved, their features still recognizable, their skin still intact. Others are little more than bundles of bones and dust. Modern science has allowed us to study them in ways the ancient Egyptians never imagined. CT scans that reveal the bodies beneath the wrappings, DNA analysis that traces family relationships, chemical analysis of the resins and oils used in preservation. And what we've learned is remarkable. We can see the diseases these people suffered: arthritis, dental abscesses, tuberculosis, malaria. We can see old injuries, broken bones that healed, surgical interventions. We can even see the embalmer's mistakes, organs left behind, incisions closed with wax or thread. In the mummy of Ramesses II, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, we can see the face of a man who died in his 90s, hook-nosed and weathered, a face that was commanded in. But for all we can see, there's much we can't. The spells whispered over the body are recorded in texts, but what did they mean to the priests who spoke them? When an Egyptian looked at a mummy, did they see a corpse? Or did they see something alive in a way we can't comprehend? The boundaries between life and death were not as firm for the Egyptians as they are for us. Death was a transition, not an ending, and the mummy was the vehicle for that transition, the boat that would carry the soul across the dark waters of the underworld to the far shore where eternal life awaited. Mummification eventually died out with the decline of the Egyptian religion, replaced first by early Christian practices, then by Islamic traditions that prohibited the elaborate preservation of the body. The last mummies were made around the 6th or 8th century CE, and then the knowledge was lost, the techniques forgotten, the purpose abandoned, but the mummies themselves remained, hidden in tombs, buried in cemeteries, stacked in catacombs. For centuries, they were treated as curiosities, even commodities. Medieval Europeans ground up mummies to make medicine, believing the preserved flesh had healing properties. Victorian explorers hosted mummy unwrapping parties, public spectacles where the bandages were removed layer by layer before an audience. Countless mummies were destroyed, burned for fuel, discarded as worthless. Only in the modern era have we begun to treat them with the respect they deserve, as the remains of people who lived and died thousands of years ago, people who believed so deeply in an afterlife that they poured enormous resources and sacred significance into preserving their bodies for eternity. Whether they achieved that eternity is a question we can't answer. Their bodies survive, yes, but as museum displays and objects of scientific study, not as vessels for souls journeying through the afterlife. If the Egyptians could see what became of their mummies, Would they be satisfied that the bodies endured, or horrified that the sacred rituals and beliefs surrounding them have been forgotten? These are questions without answers. But the mummies remain, silent and enigmatic, wrapped in linen and wrapped in mystery, waiting in the darkness of their tombs or the fluorescent light of museum cases, holding on to secrets that no CT scan can reveal, speaking in a language we've only partially learned to understand. Let me continue from where we left off, maintaining the same contemplative, mysterious tone. And to understand ancient Egypt, you must understand that death was not an ending, but a threshold. Everything, the pyramids, the mummification, the elaborate tombs, pointed toward a single obsessive question: what happens next? The Egyptians looked at death and refused to accept its finality. Instead, they constructed an entire cosmology around the journey of the soul through the afterlife, a journey as complex and dangerous as any voyage through the mortal world. The Egyptian underworld was called the Duat, and it was not a simple place. It was a vast, dark realm beneath the earth and beyond the western horizon where the sun traveled each night. The Duat was both a physical location and a spiritual dimension, a place of rivers and caverns, gates and demons, tests and transformations. Gates and transformations. To navigate it required knowledge, preparation, and help from the gods. This is where the funnery texts come in. Those elaborate collections of spells and incantations that we've found painted on tomb walls, written on coffins, inscribed on papyrus scrolls. The earliest of these are the pyramid texts, found exclusively in royal tombs of the late Old Kingdom. Dense and cryptic spells designed to transform the deceased pharaoh into a divine being and guide him to the stars. Later came the coffin texts, a democratized version of this knowledge, now available to wealthy non-royals. And finally, what we call the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians knew it as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a collection of spells that could be customized for individual buyers, beautifully illustrated scrolls that served as both guidebook and protection for the journey through the underworld. These texts describe a harrowing journey. After death, the deceased would awaken in the darkness of the Duat. They would need to pass through a series of gates, each guarded by demons with names like Bonebreaker and Eater of Filth. To pass, the deceased had to know the names of these guardians and the proper passwords. This is why the spells were so important. They were literal instructions, the names and phrases needed to proceed. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. The journey was physically dangerous. Serpents threatened to devour the deceased. Lakes of fire had to be crossed. The deceased might need to row a boat through darkness, or transform into a bird to fly across obstacles. The spells provided transformations, ways to become a falcon, a lotus flower, a phoenix, whatever form was needed to overcome each challenge. And then came the judgment. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the weighing of the heart. The deceased was brought into the Hall of Two Truths, a vast chamber where Osiris sat enthroned by 42 divine judges. Before them, the deceased had to recite the negative confession, a declaration of innocence. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. As these declarations were spoken, the deceased's heart was placed on a scale. On the other side of the scale sat a feather, the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and cosmic order. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if it was free from sin, the deceased was declared true of voice and granted eternal life. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, if it outweighed the feather, then it was fed to Ammit, the devourer, a chimeric monster with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The soul would be destroyed utterly, experiencing the second death from which there was no return. This judgment scene appears again and again in Egyptian funerary art. You can see it painted on tomb walls, illustrated in books of the dead, carved on amulets. The deceased stands before the scale, often accompanied by Anubis, who performs the weighing, while Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, records the result. Watches from the deceased's heart and the feather hang in perfect balance, or so the art always shows, because they were magical guarantees. By depicting a successful judgment, the art helped ensure it would happen. But here's where it gets philosophically interesting. The Egyptians seem to have understood at some level that humans are fallible, that everyone's heart carries some burden. So the texts include spells designed to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner, literally commanding the heart, "Do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." This raises questions about the nature of Egyptian morality. Was the judgment about actual ethical behavior, or was it about knowing the right spells, the right words to speak? Could you lie your way into the afterlife if you knew the proper incantations? Or was the magical knowledge itself considered a form of righteousness, proof that you had prepared correctly, honored the gods, maintained ma'at? Different scholars answer these questions differently, and the ancient texts themselves don't provide clarity. Egyptian religion was not a unified, codified system like modern religions. It varied by region and era, and contradictions were not seen as problems to be resolved, but as different facets of a complex truth. If you passed the judgment, if your heart was found true, you entered the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. This wasn't a place of clouds and harps. It was Egypt perfected, an idealized version of the Nile Valley where the crops grew taller, the waters were clearer, there was no pain or hunger or thirst. The deceased would live there in a house, tend fields that never failed, be reunited with loved ones who had passed before. But even in paradise, the deceased was not idle. The afterlife required work, agricultural labor to sustain yourself. This is where the Ushabti figures come in, those small human-shaped figurines placed in tombs by the hundreds. They were magical servants, animated by spells inscribed on their bodies, designed to do the work in the afterlife on behalf of the deceased. O Ushabti, if I am called to do work in the realm of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the land, you shall say, "We here I am. I will do it." The very existence of Ushabtis reveals something about Egyptian beliefs. The afterlife was concrete, material, not a vague spiritual existence, but a place where you would need food, shelter, tools. The tomb was stocked accordingly, not just with Ushabtis, but with furniture, food offerings, clothing, jewelry, games, cosmetics, everything you might need. The wealthy were buried with small models of boats, granaries, breweries, bakeries, entire estates rendered in miniature, magically activated to provide for the deceased forever. There were other destinations too, other possibilities. The royal deceased, pharaohs and queens, didn't go to the field of reeds but to the sky, joining the sun god Ra in his daily journey across the heavens and his nightly battle through the underworld. The blessed dead might become stars, particularly the circumpolar stars that never set, the imperishable ones who wheeled around the North Pole for eternity. And there were those who didn't make it, ghosts and restless spirits who failed in the journey, who lacked the proper burial or the necessary spells, who were lost in the darkness of the Duat, wandering forever. The living feared these spirits, performed rituals to placate them, left offerings at tombs to prevent the dead from returning hungry and angry. This entire cosmology, this elaborate landscape of the afterlife, reveals something profound about the Egyptian mind. They couldn't accept death as nothingness. They looked at mortality and built a story, a journey, a transformation that turned death into just another transition no more final than birth or coming of age. The universe was layered, multiple realms stacked one atop another, and death was simply movement between them. Was any of it true? That's not a question the Egyptians would have asked. Truth wasn't empirical for them. It was mythological, symbolic, enacted through ritual. When they painted the judgment scene on a tomb wall, they weren't documenting something that would happen. They were making it happen, using art as magic, using words as spells to reshape reality according to their needs. We stand now outside that belief system, studying it archaeologically, academically. We can analyze the texts, translate the spells, even appreciate the artistry and philosophical depth. But we can't know what it felt like to believe, truly believe, that beyond death lay not oblivion but a journey, challenges to overcome, a judgment to face. And beyond that, if you were worthy, an eternity in paradise. The tombs remain, painted with these scenes, filled with these texts. The mummies lie in their coffins, surrounded by objects meant for a journey they never took, at least not in the way the Egyptians imagined. And we're left to wonder what happens to a belief system when no one believes anymore. Do the spells lose their power? Does the duat empty out, its gates closing one by one? Or does it persist somehow, in a layer of reality we can't access, still there, still waiting, the way Egypt imagined it for 3,000 years? These are not questions with answers. They're the kind of thoughts that come in the dark hours, standing in a tomb deep beneath the desert, surrounded by the painted prayers of people who died millennia ago, looking at their faces staring back from the walls, eternally young, eternally hopeful, waiting for a resurrection that, as far as we can tell, never came. The gods of Egypt are not easy to understand. They resist simple categorization, shift and merge, and split apart in ways that seem contradictory to our modern, systematizing minds. There was no Egyptian Bible, no sacred text that laid out clearly who the gods were, what they wanted, how they related to each other. Instead, what we have is a sprawling, sometimes contradictory collection of myths, rituals, and religious texts accumulated over 3,000 years, varying by region and era, layered with meanings we can only partially decipher. At the most basic level, Egyptian gods embodied natural forces and fundamental aspects of existence. Ra was the sun, his daily journey across the sky reflecting the cycle of death and rebirth. Osiris was the Nile's flood, dying and rising again each year. Isis was magic itself, the power of words to change reality. Thoth was knowledge, writing, the moon's phases. Ma'at was order, truth, the proper way things should be, but they were also more than their domains. They had personalities, families, conflicts. They could be depicted in multiple forms. Ra could be shown as a falcon-headed man, or as a beetle, or as a scarab beetle pushing the sun across the sky, or as an old man leaning on a staff in the evening. The same god could have different aspects, different names. Ra became Ra-Horakhti when merged with Horus, became Amun-Ra when merged with Amun of Thebes. Were these different gods or different faces of the same god? The Egyptians didn't seem troubled by this ambiguity. Some deities were already ancient by the time Egyptian history truly began. Their worship stretched back into the distant past, so far that even the Egyptians no longer knew how it had started. Anubis, associated with burial rituals and preservation of the dead, was revered long before the pyramids were built. Hathor, linked to affection, music, and joy, remained important for thousands of years, her sanctuaries enduring across generations. Other gods gained importance later, often shaped by political change. When Thebes rose as a center of power during the Middle Kingdom, its local deity, Amun, gradually became central as well. Over time, his identity blended with that of the sun god Ra, forming Amun-Ra, a figure understood as hidden, creative, and all-encompassing. Delandians. Some gods were more unusual and difficult to define. Bes, for example, was a small, oddly shaped protective figure associated with everyday life. He was believed to watch over homes, childbirth, and children. His image appeared not in grand temples but in ordinary houses, on furniture, walls, and daily objects, suggesting a quiet, personal presence rather than distant authority. Taweret, often depicted with the form of a pregnant hippopotamus, had a similar role, offering protection to mothers and infants, standing as a symbol of strength and care within the household. Then there was Sobek, connected to the crocodile and the Nile regions where such animals were a real danger. In these areas, crocodiles were treated with respect and ritual care. Perhaps this reverence reflected an attempt to live alongside powerful natural forces, acknowledging them rather than resisting them. Egyptian stories about beginnings were just as layered. Multiple creation accounts existed at the same time without replacing one another. In one tradition, existence began when a self-formed creator emerged from the primeval waters and brought forth life. In another, creation came into being through intention and spoken word. Elsewhere, groups of early forces worked together to allow light and order to appear. These stories were not seen as contradictions, but as different ways of describing the same mystery. One narrative, however, stood at the center of Egyptian thought: the story of Osiris, Isis, and Set. Osiris represented wise and just rule. After his death at the hands of his brother Set, Isis restored him briefly through care and ritual, allowing their son Horus to be born. Osiris then became ruler of the realm beyond life, while Horus eventually took his place among the living. This story shaped how leadership itself was understood. The ruler was seen as the living Horus, maintaining continuity and balance. Upon death, he joined Osiris, and the cycle continued through the next generation. Art, ritual, and royal symbolism quietly reinforced this pattern again and again. Yet, an open question remains. How did the Egyptians themselves understand these figures? Were they seen as literal beings or as symbolic expressions of nature, life, and human experience? The answer may lie somewhere in between, fluid, reflective, and never fully fixed. The evidence suggests both. The gods dwelt in their temples, where they were represented by cult statues that required daily care, feeding, clothing, washing. Priests performed elaborate rituals, treating the statue as a living being, because in a sense it was. The gods Ka, their spiritual essence, inhabited the statue. When you made an offering to the statue, you were feeding the god. When you spoke prayers before it, the god heard. But the Egyptians also understood that these were representations, not the gods themselves. The divine was infinite, beyond full comprehension. And the statues, the myths, the rituals were ways of interacting with something that couldn't be directly perceived or fully understood. A god could be in multiple places simultaneously. The sun in the sky was Ra, but so was the statue in the temple at Heliopolis, and so were the countless depictions painted on tomb walls and carved on amulets. This kind of thinking is difficult for modern Western minds, trained on monotheism and scientific empiricism. We want things to be one way or the other, literal or symbolic, true or false. But the Egyptians seemed comfortable with a both-fashioned approach, with multiple levels of meaning coexisting, with paradoxes that didn't need resolution. Animal worship particularly confuses modern observers. The Egyptians venerated certain animals as living manifestations of gods. The Apis bull, a black bull with specific markings, was the Ba of Ptah, living in Memphis, treated with royal honors. When an Apis bull died, all Egypt mourned, and the search began for the next bull, with the correct markings who would be installed with great ceremony. Sacred ibises represented Thoth, sacred crocodiles represented Sobek, sacred cats represented Bastet. But not every bull was sacred, only the Apis bull. Not every crocodile was divine, only those in specific temple pools. The Egyptians made distinctions we struggle to understand between animals that were ordinary and animals that were manifestations of the divine, between the physical creature and the god it embodied. Toward the end of Egyptian civilization, animal worship intensified. Millions of animal mummies have been found: ibises, cats, dogs, crocodiles, even beetles, offered at temples, purchased by pilgrims seeking the favor of the gods. Entire cemeteries were devoted to mummified animals. But whether this represented genuine piety or had become a commercial enterprise, breeding and mummifying animals for profit is a matter of debate. The gods were not all-powerful or omnibenevolent in the way monotheistic religions conceive of God. They could be tricked, could fail, could conflict with each other. In one myth, Isis tricks Ra into revealing his secret name, gaining power over him. In another, the gods are unable to defeat the chaos serpent Apophis without the help of magical spells. The gods needed humans as much as humans needed gods. Temples, offerings, rituals were not just acts of worship, but necessary maintenance, feeding the gods, empowering them to continue their cosmic duties. This reveals something essential about Egyptian religion. It was transactional. You performed the rituals, made the offerings, spoke the prayers, and in return, the gods maintained Ma'at, ensured the Nile flooded, protected Egypt from enemies, granted you a good harvest, a long life, a safe journey through the afterlife. It was a relationship, a contract, beneficial to both parties. When that relationship broke down, when the gods seemed to fail, Egypt fell into crisis. Periods of drought, invasion, or political chaos were interpreted as divine displeasure, as Ma'at giving way to chaos. The solution was not to abandon the gods, but to perform the rituals more carefully, to build more temples, to make more offerings, to restore the relationship, and the temples themselves, massive stone structures that still stand today, were not churches in the modern sense. They were not gathering places for communal worship. Common people rarely entered the inner sanctums. Instead, temples were the houses of the gods, their earthly dwellings, maintained by priests who performed the daily rituals on behalf of all Egypt. You didn't go to temple to worship. You brought offerings to the outer courts and trusted that the priests would carry them inward, that your prayer would reach the god, that the divine machinery of ritual and magic would continue its work. And walking through the ruins of these temples today, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, Dendera, you can still sense something of their power. The massive pylons, the forests of columns, the walls covered with hieroglyphs and divine images, all designed to impress, to overwhelm, to remind you that you stood at the threshold between the human and divine worlds. The progression from bright courtyards to dimmer halls to the dark sanctuary, where the god dwelt, recreated the journey from the mundane world into the sacred, from the known into mystery. The gods of Egypt are long silent. Their temples are ruins or museums. The last priests who knew the rituals and spoke the prayers died 16 centuries ago. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost for over 1,000 years, only recovered in the Surgiolth century through the Rosetta Stone. For a millennium, the gods' names went unspoken, their stories unread, their images seen but not understood, and yet something lingers. Stand in a temple at dawn or dusk, when the tour groups have left and the light slants low through the ancient columns, and you might feel it. A presence, a weight, a sense that these stones remember something we've forgotten. The gods are gone, or sleeping, or simply silent. But the places they inhabited still carry an echo, a whisper of the faith that built them. The countless prayers offered, the rituals performed for thousands of years, the belief that these images, these words carved in stone, these offerings and sacrifices actually mattered, actually reached across the boundary between human and divine and kept the cosmos in balance. Whether any of it was true, whether the gods were ever there to hear the prayers, is not something archaeology can answer. But the Egyptians believed fervently and for millennia, and that belief shaped everything they built, everything they wrote, the very structure of their civilization. The gods were real to them in the way that matters most. They changed how people lived, how they understood the world, what they hoped for beyond death. And in the darkness of the empty temples, under the stars that still wheel overhead as they did when Egypt was young, you can almost imagine it. The god in the sanctuary, the priests in their rituals, the prayers rising like incense, the ancient belief that here, in this place, the divine was present, and if you spoke the right words, performed the right actions, maintained Ma'at, then perhaps, just perhaps, the gods were listening. Mien, the hieroglyphs stare back from every wall, every obelisk, every scrap of papyrus that survived the millennia to modernize their beautiful, mysterious. These images of birds and snakes and eyes and hands and symbols we can't immediately parse. But to the Egyptians, they were more than decorative. They were words, literally. The writing was the thing. To write something was to make it exist, to give it power, to change reality. This is why pharaohs' names were written in cartouches, those oval frames representing eternity. The frame protected the name magically, ensured it would endure. This is why tomb robbers sometimes chiseled out the names of the deceased from tomb walls. To erase the name was to erase the person, to kill them in the afterlife more thoroughly than any physical destruction of the mummy could achieve. Hieroglyphic writing emerged around the same time as the unification of Egypt, roughly Sansen E-byte BCE, making it one of the oldest writing systems in the world, contemporary with Mesopotamian cuneiform. But unlike cuneiform, which was pressed into clay with a reed stylus, hieroglyphs were carved and painted, designed to be visually beautiful as well as functional. The word hieroglyph comes from Greek, meaning sacred carvings, and that's what they were to the later Greeks who encountered them. By the time of Cleopatra, educated Greeks lived in Egypt, ruled Egypt, but couldn't read the ancient script covering every monument. The knowledge of hieroglyphs was already fading, restricted to a dwindling number of priests in ever fewer temples. When the last pagan temples were closed in the 6th and 5th centuries CE, when Egypt became Christian and then Islamic, hieroglyphic knowledge died completely. For over 1,000 years, nobody on earth could read the writing of ancient Egypt. Travelers looked at the inscriptions and saw only mysterious symbols, fueling wild speculation. Some thought hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, each image representing an idea or concept, impossible to pronounce, more like a visual philosophy than a language. The key to cracking the code came in, when French soldiers in Napoleon's army discovered the Rosetta Stone in the town of Rosetta Rashid in the Nile Delta. This black granodiorite slab bore the same text in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic at the top, demotic, a later Egyptian cursive script in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. If you could read Greek, and scholars could, then you had the key to the other 2 scripts. Oh, except it wasn't that simple. It took over 20 years of work by multiple scholars, most famously Jean-François Champollion, to finally crack the hieroglyphic code. The breakthrough came when Champollion realized that hieroglyphs weren't purely symbolic. They were a mixed system, some signs representing sounds, phonograms, others representing ideas or categories, determinatives, and still others functioning as both, depending on context. The key was the cartouches, those oval frames containing royal names. Champollion focused on the name Ptolemy, written in Greek on the Rosetta Stone and presumably in hieroglyphs in one of the cartouches. By comparing the hieroglyphic version with the Greek, he could start assigning sound values to individual signs. When he found another cartouche he suspected was Cleopatra, and saw that some of the signs matched the ones in Ptolemy's name where the same sounds occurred, he knew he was onto something. In İçen-Babe Arsar, Champollion published his findings, and for the first time in Subet years, someone could read the words of the pharaohs. It was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 13th century, opening up an entire lost civilization to study, giving voice to people who had been silent for millennia. What Champollion discovered was a complex, sophisticated writing system. Hieroglyphs could be read left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, depending on the text's layout. You could tell which direction to read by looking at which way the animal and human figures faced. You read toward them, into their gaze. Some signs represented single sounds, like our alphabet. Others represented 2 or 3 consonants. Still others were determinatives, not pronounced at all, but placed at the end of words to clarify meaning. The sign for a walking man might be added after a word to indicate it involves motion or action. There were no vowels, or rather, the vowels weren't written, only consonants and semiconsonants. This makes pronunciation uncertain. When Egyptologists write Tutankhamun, they're inserting vowels based on educated guesses, later Greek transcriptions, and Coptic, the descendant of ancient Egyptian that survived as the liturgical language of Egyptian Christians. But the actual pronunciation has been debated and likely varied over Egypt's long history. The hieroglyphic script itself was reserved for sacred purposes, carved on temples, tombs, monuments. For everyday writing, scribes used hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, quicker to write with pen and ink on papyrus. Later, an even more abbreviated script called demotic developed, but they were all the same language underneath. Egyptian, which evolved over thousands of years, from Old Egyptian to Middle Egyptian to Late Egyptian to Demotic Egyptian to Coptic, finally mixing with Greek and Arabic until the ancient language was transformed beyond recognition. Now, being a scribe was prestigious. It meant education, literacy, access to power. Scribes kept the records, collected the taxes, recorded the laws, copied the sacred texts. They were essential to the functioning of the Egyptian state. Statues of scribes show them sitting cross-legged, a papyrus scroll rolled out across their laps, looking alert, ready to write. These weren't laborers. They were the educated elite, and they knew it. One text, the satire of the trades, has a father advising his son to become a scribe rather than pursue any other profession. Perfection, listing all the hardships of manual labor and declaring that the scribes is the only comfortable life. But literacy was rare. Estimates suggest only about 5% of the population could read and write, and even among that 5% few could read the full hieroglyphic script. Priests could, high officials could, but even many of the upper class relied on professional scribes for their writing needs. The act of writing was itself considered magical. The god Thoth, depicted as an ibis-headed man or as a baboon, was the inventor of writing, the scribe of the gods. Writing was his gift to humanity, a tool for creating order, recording truth, casting spells. The hieroglyphs used in magical and religious contexts weren't just representing words. They were embodying the things they depicted. Writing the name of a god invoked that god's presence. Writing a spell made the spell real. This is why some hieroglyphs in tombs were deliberately drawn, incomplete or damaged. If you carved the image of a snake or a lion in a tomb, you might inadvertently bring that dangerous creature to life in the afterlife. So the image would be shown with a knife through it, or without its dangerous parts, neutralized before it could pose a threat. And this is why destroying someone's inscriptions was such a powerful curse. When Akhenaten tried to erase the old gods and establish his new religion centered on the Aten, his followers defaced temples, chiseling out the names of Amun and other gods. When Akhenaten's revolution failed and traditional religion was restored, his own names and images were systematically destroyed, his monuments torn down, his capital city abandoned. It wasn't just political, it was magical warfare, an attempt to erase someone from existence itself by destroying their written name and image. We've recovered vast amounts of Egyptian writing, religious texts, administrative records, literary works, personal letters, magical spells, medical treatises, mathematical problems, astronomical observations. Each new discovery adds to our understanding, but also reveals how much more there is to learn. Many texts are fragmentary, damaged by time. Many others remain untranslated or poorly understood, their context lost. Their references to people and events we no longer know, and there are mysteries still. Some texts seem to be deliberately cryptic, using rare signs or unusual spellings, perhaps to restrict their reading to initiated priests. Some symbols appear whose meaning we're not entirely sure of. Some entire categories of text, like many of the medical and magical papyri, contain procedures and spells we can translate literally but can't fully understand practically. What does it mean to drive away a demon of disease? How did the ritual actually work? The more you study Egyptian texts, the more you realize how much is lost in translation, not just linguistically, but culturally. When an Egyptian writes about becoming an what does that feel like to them? When they describe the soul as a ba, depicted as a human-headed bird, are they speaking metaphorically or describing something they believed was physically real? We can translate the words, but can we truly understand the concepts behind them? No. And then there are the texts we've lost completely. The Library of Alexandria, that great repository of ancient knowledge, contained countless Egyptian texts, histories, religious treatises, works of literature and philosophy. When it burned, whether gradually through neglect and various conquests or in one catastrophic fire, depending on which account you believe, all that knowledge vanished. We have references to Egyptian historians, philosophers, scholars whose works once existed but survive now only as citations in Greek and Roman authors. What did those lost texts contain? What knowledge, what perspectives on Egyptian religion and history, what answers to our questions burned with them? The texts that do survive have given us entry into the Egyptian mind. But it's an incomplete entry, a partial translation not just of words, but of an entire worldview. We can read the spells, but we can't fully believe them the way an Egyptian would. We can study the administrative records, but we see them as historical documents, not as the everyday reality of people long dead. We can translate the love poems and feel their emotional resonance across thousands of years, and yet we're always aware of the gulf, the distance, the impossibility of fully inhabiting the consciousness of someone who lived so long ago in such a different world. Still, the hieroglyphs speak. Every translation brings ancient voices back to life, lets us hear echoes of people who worried and hoped and feared and loved, people who believed their words would last forever, and thanks to their stone and papyrus and the determination of modern scholars, they were right. The words have lasted, the language has been recovered, And as long as someone can read hieroglyphs, as long as someone stands before a temple wall and sounds out the ancient script, the Egyptians continue to speak, bridging the silence of millennia with words carved in stone. When we think of ancient Egypt, we often picture pharaohs and pyramids, gold and glory. But what was life actually like for the ordinary people, the Bavane who weren't royalty or priests or high officials? What did a farmer think about as he guided his plow through the black soil left by the Nile's flood? What did a woman grinding grain into flour dream about? What did children play at in the narrow streets of mud brick villages? The truth is, we know less about common life than we'd like. The archaeological record is biased toward the elite. Pharaohs built in stone, peasants built in mud brick which crumbles and disappears. The wealthy were buried in decorated tombs that survived. The poor were buried in simple graves that rarely preserved much beyond bones and a few possessions. The texts that survived were written by and for the educated class, not by illiterate farmers or laborers. But we can piece together a picture from what remains. Tomb paintings meant to show the deceased's life and ensure its continuation in the afterlife often depict scenes of daily work, plowing, harvesting, herding cattle, making bread and beer, fishing, hunting. These give us glimpses of ordinary activities. Archaeological excavation of workers' villages, particularly at Deir el-Medina, the community of artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, has revealed much and scattered letters, accounts, and legal documents on ostraca pottery shards and papyrus fill in more details. The rhythm of life followed the Nile. During Aket, the inundation season, when the fields were underwater, agricultural work paused. This was when the pharaoh could call up labor crews for construction projects, pyramid building, temple maintenance, quarrying stone. Workers were fed and housed, serving their labor obligation to the state. During Pare, the growing season, farmers worked their fields. Most land was technically owned by the pharaoh or temples, with farmers working it in exchange for a share of the harvest. They planted emmer wheat and barley, the staples of the Egyptian diet. They tended onions, lettuce, cucumbers, beans. In orchards and gardens, they grew dates, figs, pomegranates, grapes. The work was hard, done mostly by hand with simple tools. A wooden plow, pulled by oxen, broke the soil. Sickles with flint blades cut grain. Grain was threshed by driving cattle over it, then winnowed by tossing it in the air so the wind carried away the chaff. Every step required labor, and labor meant long days under the Egyptian sun. During Shemu, harvest season, the grain was collected, measured, recorded by scribes, and taxed. This was when the tax collectors came, often accompanied by enforcers who could be brutal to those who couldn't pay. Scenes in tombs sometimes show beatings of tax delinquents, a reminder that the Egyptian state, for all its religious grandeur, maintained order through force when necessary. Yet the harvest determined your fate for the year. A good harvest meant security, enough to eat, surplus to trade. A bad harvest meant hunger, debt, disaster. The Egyptians lived close to subsistence, even in good times. When the Nile's flood failed, when drought came, people starved. The memory of such famines was preserved in texts like the story of Sinue, and administrative records documenting the distribution of grain from royal stores during lean years. The Egyptian diet was simple but relatively nutritious. Bread and beer were the foundation, made from the same grain, just processed differently. Bread came in various forms, from coarse loaves full of grit that wore down teeth Egyptian mummies often show severe dental wear to finer breads for the wealthy. Beer was thick, nutritious, mildly alcoholic, drunk by everyone including children. Beyond bread and beer, the diet included vegetables, fish from the Nile, occasional fowl, and for the wealthy, meat. Beef was a luxury, associated with the rich and with religious offerings. Pork was eaten but had an ambiguous status, sometimes associated with Set, the god of chaos. The very wealthy had access to imported delicacies, honey for sweetening, wine instead of beer, exotic spices and ingredients that came up the trade routes from Nubia or across the Mediterranean. Housing was simple. Most Egyptians lived in mud brick structures, 1 or 2 rooms, flat-roofed. In the heat, people often slept on the roof. Furnishings were minimal: reed mats, low stools, perhaps a wooden bed frame strung with rope. The wealthy had more elaborate homes, multi-room villas with internal courtyards, plastered and painted walls, glazed tile decorations, but these were rare. Clothing was light, adapted to the climate. Men wore simple kilts or loincloths. Women wore straight sheath dresses. Both were usually made of linen, Egypt's main textile, woven from flax grown along the Nile. The wealthy wore finer linens, pleated and draped elaborately, sometimes so fine as to be nearly transparent. They adorned themselves with jewelry, gold, precious stones, faience beads in bright colors. The poor might wear simple copper or shell jewelry, or none at all. Children went naked, or nearly so, until puberty. They worked alongside their parents from a young age, learning the family trade, whether farming, craftsmanship, or scribble arts. Boys learned their father's profession. Girls learned household management from their mothers, grinding grain, baking bread, weaving, managing the home. Education was limited. For most children, education meant practical training in their family's work. Formal education, learning to read and write, was restricted to those training to be scribes, a path that required sponsorship and years of practice. Scribble schools were harsh, with corporal punishment common. One proverb states, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten." Family life was central. Marriage was not a religious ceremony but a social arrangement, often formalized by a couple simply moving in together. Women had significant rights by ancient standards. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business. In legal texts, women appear as parties to contracts, as plaintiffs and defendants in court cases. The ideal was a nuclear family, husband, wife, children, though the reality could be more complex, with multiple generations and extended family members living in close proximity. Religion permeated daily life, but not in the way we might expect. The great temples were distant, managed by professionals. Common people had household shrines, small niches, with images of protective deities like Bes and Taweret. They wore amulets for protection, recited prayers, made small offerings. Local festivals brought the god's statue out in procession, a rare chance for common people to see the divine image, though even then it was hidden in a shrine, carried on the shoulders of priests. Magic and religion blurred. If you were sick, you might consult a physician who combined medical treatments which could be surprisingly sophisticated, including surgery, dentistry, and pharmaceutical preparations, with magical spells. If you suspected a neighbor of cursing you, you might commission a counter-curse. If you wanted someone to fall in love with you, there were love spells, often involving surprising ingredients and procedures that mixed the romantic and the grotesque. Work varied. Besides farmers, there were craftsmen, carpenters, metalworkers, potters, weavers, jewelers. There were fishermen working the Nile, hunters in the marshes. There were scribes and administrators managing the vast bureaucracy. There were soldiers, professional fighters, but also conscripts, called up when Pharaoh went to war. There were merchants, though trade was often state-controlled or managed by temples. There were servants, though Egyptian servitude seems to have been more like contracted labor than chattel slavery. And women worked too, primarily in household production, but also as weavers, singers, dancers, even occasionally as priests, especially priestesses of Hathor. In the New Kingdom, there are references to professional mourners, women hired to wail and perform grief rituals at funerals. Entertainment included music, dancing, board games like Senet, a game of strategy and chance that had religious significance, storytelling, festivals with processions and feasting. The Egyptians loved humor, including ribald jokes and satirical tales. They appreciated beauty, decorating their homes with painted walls, cultivating gardens, wearing cosmetics and jewelry. But underlying it all was hardship. Life expectancy was short, perhaps century 4 years on average, though those who survived childhood might live longer. Disease was common, parasites from the Nile water, infections from injuries, malnutrition during lean years. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child. Child mortality was high, perhaps befriended urgers. Before Age Wu, violence was a risk. Crime existed, theft and assault and murder. Punishment could be harsh, beatings, mutilation, execution. We have records of trials, of people sentenced to forced labor or death. We also have evidence of banditry, of desert tribes raiding settlements, of social disorder during weak dynasties. Yet people endured, found joy, raised families, created art, told jokes, fell in love, mourned their dead. In letters preserved on ostraca and papyrus, we hear their voices, a son asking his mother to send beer, a woman complaining about her neighbor, a worker reporting sick, a widower mourning his wife and asking priests to investigate whether her death was natural or caused by malevolence. And these glimpses humanize the ancient Egyptians, remind us that they were people like us, living lives shaped by their time and culture, but feeling the same emotions, facing the same fundamental challenges of existence. They worried about their children, their health, their security. They hoped for prosperity, for a good harvest, for a peaceful life. They believed deeply in the gods and the afterlife, investing enormous energy into preparations for death because they couldn't bear the thought of simply ceasing to exist. And then they died, and most were forgotten. Their names weren't carved in stone. Their tombs weren't filled with treasures. They lived, worked, loved, suffered, and vanished into the sand, leaving behind at most a few pottery shards, some tools, bones in an unmarked grave. The Egypt we remember is the Egypt of kings and monuments. But the Egypt that actually existed day to day was the Egypt of these ordinary people, whose lives are mostly lost to us, but who were the foundation upon which all the glory rested.